Welcome back to Interview Ninja Step 73. We're going to try and broaden perspective to see a bigger picture of the society around you. Often young people don't think much beyond the boundaries of their home and their school, and maybe even the town they live in. But there is a lot more going on around them, and it can impact their lives quite seriously. Is the place where you live in conflict or even at war with a different society? And if so, why? So in this step, we give Corben some guidance as to what might be causing those kinds of conflicts. Corben, and maybe you, has grown up in a country where he's never experienced war, but he's going to a part of the world where it's a daily, practical thing in their lives, or a very powerful influence on their parents and the generation before them, because in the last 50 years there has been an awful lot of war in the Asia-Pacific area. And a country like Korea, for example, is still officially at war, with a war going on between the North and the South. Step 73 starts with a continuation of the discussion about the so-called Cod Wars, which took place way back in 1958, but that whole issue of fisheries still hasn't got sorted out. It was changed a lot in 1970, and even today, as I'm talking to you, which is 2021, there are still very passionate arguments going on about it. I'm doing it because it's a very interesting example of what's called PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. You can do a degree in the UK in PPE, and it's very often the course of choice for the children of the elite class, because in a way it prepares you for politics and public discussion, and generally being a leader in the government sphere. It doesn't really help you that much in the commercial sphere, but it's good to have a broad idea of what PPE is all about.
And I guess you could say we lost. But in a way we won, because it was set a precedent for 12-mile fishing limits. So then we said, well, if they're doing it, we're doing it. And so we set a 12-mile fishing limit. And then about that time, what happened next was we joined the European Economic Community. And so then the countries in Europe that like to fish got us to agree a quota. Every country in Europe had a quota of how much fish they could take from the whole European area, excluding Iceland. And to be honest, we got screwed. And a lot of our fishing communities went broke because the Spanish are very, very aggressive about fishing, and they use much finer nets, and generally, they kind of screw over a fishing area. And the council minister in Brussels, in charge of fisheries, was a Spanish lady. So she kind of fixed the rules.
She approved everything that they were doing.
Yeah. So the Spanish fisheries were doing that. And then the next thing, Spanish fisheries got away with that, the Spanish boats. So they then went over to an area that's like 100 miles to the east of Canada, and they were fishing over there. And the Canadians said, hey, we fish here. We don't want you fishing here.
Not many people know about the 1995 Turbot Wars, as opposed to the much earlier Cod Wars. It doesn't get talked about because it was so political, especially for Europe, Scandinavia, Ireland, and Great Britain, and even Norway and Greenland got dragged into the argument. The EU supported, that's Brussels, supported Spain, but Britain and Ireland supported Canada, despite being officially in the European Union. It's an early example of Brussels and European Union versus UK, especially to do with fish. To be honest, it's so blooming complicated. There's no real value for you to understand the details of it, but it's an interesting example of how these things just get wider and wider in terms of their scope, and more people get dragged in to what is basically a pretty simple issue. And in the end, hopefully, talking and politics is the best way to solve it. The other way to solve it is with bombs and bullets, of course. But let's hope in your lifetime it'll be confined to what's called sanctions, which is a kind of economic warfare, but without young people getting their arms and legs blown off or killed, of course.
The Spanish said, well, screw you, this is international waters.
Yeah.
And the Canadian Navy said, well, you may think that, but we've decided this is our fishing grounds. And they drove off the Spanish fishing fleet. So, but it wasn't even 12 miles, it was like 100 miles from Canada. But it just proved that on the high seas, countries that have got the bottle to insist that this is our space,
Get it.
Yeah. And the Canadians did it.
100 miles out.
Now, there's a final part of this whole discussion. Come back to where you're going, which is Asia and the seas around Asia. So there's a big face-off going on at the moment between China and Japan and America of who controls the seas around that part of the world. And there's these little islands that different countries lay claim to.
Cool.
Because by claiming an island, you get the 12 miles around it. So it's not the islands, it's, well, if you agree that's our island, then we get all the fishing rights. So there's big arguments going on about that.
Another example, by the way, is in 2019, which is not very long ago, the Turkish started drilling off Cyprus and looking for oil, and they found some. And it's caused the most huge row between Greece and Turkey, who've always been arguing for thousands of years, and especially anything anywhere near Cyprus, which has actually been split as a country. When that split happened and Turkey landed paratroopers and they started marching across from the north to the south of Cyprus, they could easily have marched the whole way. But the Brits, Great Britain, had a huge airbase in southern Cyprus called Akrotiri, and we actually persuaded the Turks to stop. So that island, which I love going to, is split north for Turkey and south for what's still called Cyprus. There is actually a buffer zone between the north and the south, which is occupied by United Nations troops. Not such a bad gig, really, because Cyprus is a lovely country.
And finally, the final thing is, you may have heard of the Falklands conflict. Okay, Falklands is a string of islands where people don't realize it's a string of islands. It is a string of islands that's at least 200 miles long.
Yeah.
And the Argentinians have always laid claim to it, and we've laid claim to it. Another of these treaties, a bit like Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's not even a treaty. We landed there, we parked our bloody flag and said, this is ours. Like people worry about people going to the moon or Mars or whatever, and sticking your flag down saying this is ours. So that's the case with the Falklands. Only for that, it's not fish, it's oil. And a lot of people don't know that around those, not the main Falkland Island itself, but further south as you go to that
Whichever one is in the south.
Yeah. There's oil down there, and we've hung on to that, and that's why we sent our fleet and had that stuff with Argentina to keep domination of those territorial waters which we lay claim to. Yeah, it's pretty much the end of the lecture. Has turned into a lecture, hasn't it?
No, that was really interesting. That's loads of top quality stuff.
Do you have any?
If the Game of Thrones of conflict and history about past wars interests you, then why not have a go at looking at the future? Because oil and gas, especially now, it used to be oil, now it's mostly gas, has been the cause of pretty well most of the conflicts in the last 50 years. So here's a couple of maps of what's going on in the North Sea between UK, Great Britain, and Europe, and see if you can work out what's likely to happen as the different political and geopolitical interests get going, because the whole picture just encompasses not just UK and Europe, but also America, and there's a pipeline between Russia and Europe now, North Sea Stream or something or other, and that's also plays into the whole game of where does oil come from? But, and it is a big but, the Institute of Practical Learning is all about not what's just interesting, but what's practical and what's going to help you in your life and your career and being happy. And it's difficult sometimes to draw the line between what's interesting and what's practical. So I'm going to have to shut up on all this stuff because it really, really is interesting, but it's not really going to help you get a job. So let's get on with it. I'll give you a clue. Who owns Shell Oil? And another one. What would the Germans have to gain from all of this? And finally, why do the French get so little out of it?
Okay. Let me have one last thing.
Yeah.
What would really please me is on this trip, as well as keeping your eyes open, understanding the history, reading a bit of the background of the little history books, Lonely Planet. Engage with the culture, but also engage with the music, because you will find the chromatic scales and the instruments and the sound very, it takes some getting used to. But once you get used to it, it's fabulous. And it's so different. You think, well, how come these people think of this as music? No, it sounds like bing bong, bing bong, bing bong, bong, bong.
Yeah.
So it's not our chromatic scale. But it's something about, it kind of gets into your soul in the context when you're there.
No, it's much more to do with like the feeling of it as opposed to the theory of it, right? So that they would have.
Well, first of all, it's probably far more sophisticated and culturally rich than anything we've got. There are people who are from the American culture, and they've travelled around Africa and Latin America and so on, exploring what are the sounds, what's the music. And if you think in America, the African sounds of the drum beat and the rhythm and jazz and rap and all, that's a bit more obvious. But you're going, well, it's obvious to us now.
Yeah.
And
I can't wait to hear all the weird
the rhythms
and how
and the
they
beats
think
and
about
everything.
things. And,
yeah. So I don't know if you're going to record anything or make notes of anything.
Yes, I am. I've got set up so I can record everything wherever I am.
Okay. So what's worth remembering then, as a last thing, is now in this culture, because there's so many immigrants, but it infiltrates it, rhythm and beats and sounds. They cross cultures. So there's things like banga, which is, my understanding is it's like predominantly Indian type beat, and there are other rhythms. This is your language. I don't know the difference between rhythms and beats and chromatic scales and everything else, and that's genuine ignorance. Okay.
Yeah.
But you'll be out there and you'll be experiencing it. So think: is this something I can do? Is this something that I could do? I could be a leader in a cross-cultural revolution. And there's 1 billion people in China, and there's 1 billion people in India. They're all getting richer and richer. Maybe you are going to become the global Corben. I didn't push you on your name. The doorbell rang.
Oh, of course. Shall I stop this?
Stop it. Record it. I'm going to the door.
Top notch.
In step 74, we pick up from when Corben has returned following his world tour. He has some serious decisions to make about his future and getting on quickly with the right kind of interviews based on his choice of direction. These following steps are a more practical guide on interview techniques and preparation and activity before, during and after. And I think you will find them helpful if you do have some pretty serious interviewing ahead of you.